to her for stepping up and offering today's talk. And I think it's properly titled Celebrating the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Miriam?
Thank you, Paul, for this opportunity. Whoa, I feel tall. It was the spring of 1978. I was at the university in Montreal, and I had been accepted into the graduate program at the University of Georgia in Athens, home of the Bulldogs. One of the professors wanted to speak to me about living in Athens, Georgia. So I went to his office and we talked about a lot of things. And he told me to be careful about talking to Black people. It's not like here, he said, you have to be careful. And I told him that I wasn't a racist and I talked to everybody. So in the fall, I took the train down to Atlanta and I needed to catch the bus to Athens. And I was at the train station and there were two train station employees, one Black and one white. The white guy, I seem to recall, was the manager and the Black employee was a clerk or something like that. I asked the white employee if he could call me a taxi, and he looks at my luggage, my backpack, my bicycle, my guitar, and he says, my stuff won't fit in a cab. He said, I have a convertible, and with the top down, we can fit your stuff in. And I say, please, no, just a cab. And he says, this is train policy. We can help people. So I go to the Black employee and I stand right close to him and I ask him quietly if this is train policy, if this is safe. And the white employee sees us and he's threatening, he's glaring at him threateningly, and the Black employee is shaking in his boots and backing away from me. This is what my professor had meant. I realized right there and then about being careful. I had put the Black employee in a terrible position of perhaps needing to cross somebody who had power over him, and not just as a supervisor, but in a nefarious sort of way. So I felt compelled to take the ride. I said, thank you, out loud to the Black guy as though he had told me it would be okay. And we all smiled, and we were on the freeway when the man put his hand on my leg and told me he'd take me all the way to Athens. I took his hand off and said, just the bus station, please, and thankfully he complied. A year later, in 1979, President Jimmy Carter called on Congress to vote on a bill to honor King with a federal holiday. The bill was defeated by 5 votes in the House. From my enclave in Canada, I had no clue how things were in the American South. When I got there, fellow students at the University of Georgia proclaimed alternate truths about the Civil War. Summers in Gwinnett County, then a mostly rural area where my research field station was located, immersed me in a culture that didn't necessarily believe all the propaganda that the KKK dispersed, but they weren't willing to challenge it. My host family drove me to Forsyth County, where they showed me a road sign indicating that it was a sundown county. In Athens, Jim and I found KKK literature tossed into our driveway. Less than 2% of the faculty at the University of Georgia were Black, so neighborhoods were pretty segregated. Busing resulted in integrated public schools. And working later in the Athens Middle School, in one of the Athens Middle Schools, it was nice to see a general rule that racist slurs and racist behavior were not tolerated. The kids got along pretty well at Clark Central, but police patrolled the halls at Cedar Shoals School. From the 1955 bus boycott to the 1963 Birmingham confrontation, to the 1965 Selma to Montgomery Voting Rights March, and so much more, Dr. King stressed the urgency of systemic change to protect the disenfranchised. With hard work planning, organizing, teaching nonviolent resistance, and brilliant oratory, he played a large part in the movement that finally brought truth to the people in power. A Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlining racial discrimination in employment, voting, and the use of public facilities was signed by President Lyndon Johnson with Dr. King by his side, despite a 75-day filibuster by Southern senators. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was signed into law, and by the end of that year, 250,000 new Black voters had been registered. In his Ware lecture at the UU General Assembly in 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "It may be true that you can't legislate integration, but you can legislate desegregation. It may be true that morality cannot be legislated, but behavior can be regulated. It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless. The law cannot make a man love me, but it can restrain him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important also." And so while the law may not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men. So it is necessary for the church to support strong, meaningful civil rights legislation. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife were very close friends to the UU churches. We remember Reverend James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo, who both died doing anti-discrimination work with King in Selma, Alabama. Coretta Scott King said in an interview with Rosemary Bray McNatt in 2002, "Oh, I went to the Unitarian churches for years. I didn't know this. Even before I met Martin," she said, explaining that she had been since college a member of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was popular among Unitarians and Universalists. "And Martin and I went to Unitarian churches when we were in Boston." McNatt reflects, though, and paraphrases Coretta Scott King when she says, "We gave a lot of thought to becoming Unitarian at one time, but Martin and I realized that we could never build a mass movement of Black people if we were Unitarian. The Baptist Church was one of the largest places and spaces where the Black community was centered. And for King, his mission and his ethics were always centered in his religious experience." Now, this is from Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman was in South Africa when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, and he eulogized him, and he said, "Thus, organized religion as we know it in our society found itself with its back against the wall. To condemn him, to reject him, was to reject the ethical insight of the faith it proclaimed. And this was new. Racial prejudice, segregation, discrimination were not regarded by him as merely un-American, undemocratic, but as a mortal sin against God. For those who are religious, it awakens guilt. For those who are merely superstitious, it inspires fear. And it was this fear that pulled the trigger of the assassin's gun that took his life." Martin Luther King Jr. had been such a hero of mine and my family. I remembered when, as a youth, just coming into greater awareness of the world, the gut punch of sadness and despair when he was shot. His work to create change, his vision, and his dedication to nonviolent resistance had been a beacon in those years. I see Martin Luther King Jr.'s words as being as relevant today as ever, and as important in the North as in the South. I read Facebook posts by Parker Palmer, a well-known Quaker theologian activist from Wisconsin. And on November 4th, he posted about a class he was teaching in 2016. He asked his white students to look at the electoral map of our country and take a county by county look at their state. And then he asked them to try something that some of them might find difficult, to imagine that they are a person of color looking at the map. And he asked, looking at this map and at all those red counties and small sections of blue, how would you feel about where this country is going? Would you think, and I quote him, after 240 years, I'm still unwelcome in vast patches of my own place on earth. Sometimes it's really hard to imagine the moral arc of the universe and how long it takes to turn toward justice. But the challenge for us is, as it was back in the 1960s, to empathize with the frustration and anger of the disenfranchised while staying laser focused on the nonviolent strategies that King taught us. Howard Thurman reminded listeners of how difficult it is to see nonviolent direct action as an effective strategy for change. And it was King, he said, who articulated for us the feeling that we knew deep inside that violence must be rejected when he stated, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. We have come a long way thanks to the civil rights heroes of the 1960s. Look at what has come from the efforts and sacrifices, the work and successes of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Ralph Abernathy, Malcolm X, Representative John Lewis, and so many more. Standing on the broad shoulders of these giants, civil rights activists like the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. Also, people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Michelle Alexander, just to name a few. And these are successful people and well known for their work. And think about Stacey Abrams and what she helped accomplish in Georgia last November and in the January Senate race. I left Athens in 1983. And in 1984, Georgia recognized Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a state holiday. It did not become a federal holiday until 1986. And this, in the states of Alabama and Mississippi, it still collides with Robert E. Lee Day. In the late 1980s, Gwinnett County saw a vast number of infrastructure and civic improvements and became one of the fastest growing counties in the country. That was where that research station was. In both the 2016 and the 2020 elections, Gwinnett County voted blue. Forsyth was still red, that's Sundown County, but it's no longer a Sundown County. Athens has leaned blue since 1988. And last year in Athens, as the featured speaker for the Martin Luther King Day celebration at the University of Georgia, Stacey Abrams spoke these hopeful words. His dream lives on in all of us. We each hold his mantle and we each hold his challenge. We have to move forward because our eyes are constantly on that prize that has eluded us for too long, but is tantalizingly close. We are Americans because we believe in liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam, very much.